the summit on a ledge of an unclimbed peak in a remote part of the Himalayas. But this rock, it had my number on it. It hit a ledge, ricocheted off, went off, and crushed my left leg. You know, the pain was indescribable. It's like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. Bleeding out with, you know, or my lower leg literally hanging off me by the clothing. I've always loved sport. Sport is my religion. And, you know, since I was, young teenager, since I was about 16 or something, I think climbing and mountaineering, and in particular, just big mountains have fascinated me. And I remember going to the public library. I was brought up in North London, in an area called Muswell Hill. And I went to the public library and I got out this book called Everest the Hard Way by Chris Bonington. It's not an amazing book, it's not particularly well written, but I just found it, the whole story around their new route on Everest and the adversity, the challenges, the adventure, you know, elements of danger as well. I just, as a kind of 13, 14-year-old, I think I must have been then, I got really kind of excited. And, you know, obviously being brought up in North London, I mean, you're not near any mountains there. I mean, you're as far away as you could be almost from like a mountain environment. But I just had this innate love of them. And so I kind of gradually, I went to university, I did my degree in Bristol, and I just started to go to the mountains, explore and go rock climbing, and then ultimately started mountaineering. I've always loved, you know, beautiful mountains. So Tependio, it's a beautiful looking peak. It's like this needle-like spire, and nobody had climbed it before. Who wouldn't want to stand on top of an unclimbed peak for the very first time and to be able to say, oh yeah, I was the first person to be on the summit of that amazing mountain. It's just a, you know, incredibly exciting, thrilling, really captivating kind of goal, I think. So September the 2nd, 1992, that was the day that everything changed for me. So before getting on the mountain, I think we were pretty fired up and pretty enthusiastic. We were aiming to attempt to climb two unclimbed virgin peaks in the region. And it was meant to be, I think, about 6-week expedition. And with quite a long walk in, it took about a week to walk into the base camp at an altitude of almost 4,000 meters already at the base camp. And we tried, or at least we did a warm-up peak, which was about 5,500 meters elevation, a relatively easy peak to climb that had been climbed before, just to kind of get acclimatized and make sure all our kit was good and that kind of thing. And then second peak we were going to attempt was one of these unclimbed peaks. It's called Tependio. It's very spectacular, it's very steep. If you've got a kid to draw a picture of a mountain, it's pretty much, you know, what you'd expect them to make a picture of. I was climbing with my regular climbing partner, just the two of us on the mountain that time. We'd been on it about 2 or 3 days. The following day we set off, and I think we were making pretty good progress, but there was a lot of this snow covering the surfaces. So maybe 100 meters, perhaps 150 meters from the summit of this unclimbed peak. So we were quite excited. And my climbing partner was above me, just getting onto the ridge, overcoming the hardest part of the climb. I think he stood on a block covered in snow, dislodged, came down the face, and I wasn't in what's called the fall line. I wasn't directly beneath him. When you're belaying, you always belay off to one side, you know, so that if something does come down, you're out of the way. But this rock, it had my number on it, you know, because it hit a ledge, ricocheted off, went off, and crushed my left leg. It pretty much severed my lower leg. You know, we were near the summit of an unclimbed peak in a remote part of the Himalayas, and I was bleeding out with, you know, or my lower leg literally hanging off me by the clothing that I was wearing. And Angus, my climbing partner, he could not get me down on his own. I was obviously in a really bad way. I was losing a lot of blood. I was losing consciousness. I couldn't really look after myself. Obviously, you know, the pain was indescribable. It's like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. There was nothing else in your world apart from this overwhelming sense of pain. You know, it's kind of just every nerve in your body screaming at you. And so Angus basically managed to lower me about a rope length. Had to leave me there to get help from other people in the team. So he kind of basically put me in a sleeping bag and abseiled back down the mountain. And I was on this ledge for a little bit more than 2 days. Without question, the longest 2 days of my life. Every minute felt like a day, you know, time passed so slowly, you know, there's nothing I could do. It was like, what do you think about in situations like that? It was pretty challenging. I absolutely 100% thought my time was up, you know. I mean, the chances of getting off the mountain alive, I thought, were close to zero, really. And yeah, I was there on my own and just sort of waiting. Angus abseiled back down. He then had to reclimb the route back to where we were with one of the other people in the team, a very, very strong climber, a guy called Luke. They had an extra rope with them. They had also some drugs that stopped me dying of gangrene, because I had contracted gangrene by that point and had blood poisoning, but they had some IV antibiotics, which they gave me, some strong painkillers, and they started to lower me down the mountain. That took, you know, one rope length at a time. That took 2 days. It took 2 days to get me to the bottom of the mountain. And then it took another 2 days to carry me over these huge boulder fields back down to base camp, where a helicopter, Indian Army helicopter, could fly in and take me out to a hospital in northern India, where I had some emergency surgery just to basically stop me dying. And so there was a high risk of me contracting sepsis and like not making it. So they had to fly me to Delhi as soon as they possibly could, an emergency flight where they took 7 seats out of this aircraft and put me in a stretcher. And then I was in a private hospital in Delhi for about 2 weeks. I had, I think, 2 more operations there, which were also really slow and long because there was no one there, and you know, I was still in a lot of pain and discomfort. After about 2 weeks, I was stable enough to be flown back to the UK. 7 more operations, I think, on my leg. So they took a muscle out of my shoulder blade, my latissimus dorsi, out of here, stitched it in vein by vein, had a skin graft from my thigh that was put on the back and the front of my leg to cover that up. That was the easy bit. It was all the surgery on the bone that proved difficult, because I had what's called non-union of fracture. That's where the 2 ends of the bone aren't uniting and aren't meeting. And so I had a whole load of orthopedic surgery as well. And this was over a period of almost 4 years. So it was 3.5 years I was unable to walk. I was on crutches that whole time. I can remember my orthopedic surgeon saying to me, you know, he's pretty blunt, he said, yeah, okay, that is a pretty bad break. Well, look, you know, if you're able to walk to the shops and back, that'll be a really good outcome. In fact, after 3 years of not being able to walk and still having an infection in the bone, he recommended, and all the medical professionals I was seeing recommended that I should have an amputation. And I know you can be super functional, and I know there are people out there who have done amazing things with amputations and prosthetic legs and stuff, but for me that was just kind of really devastating news. I was determined as I could be not to lose my leg, and so I bought an exercise bike, one of those static bikes you just sit on and, you know, go around. Unbelievably boring, but I just put that in the garage and just did like half an hour every other day. That was kind of the first time I'd have had any exercise for the best part of 3 years, I suppose. My leg was incredibly emaciated. I'd lost any muscle from my left leg. It was so weak. Getting on a bicycle and just riding 3 miles round a little circuit, it felt like being let out of prison. It was an incredible feeling, because up until that point, I'd basically been hobbling around on crutches everywhere I went, and it felt so restrictive compared to how my life had been. And so getting on that bike, it was an amazing experience, super liberating. You know, there's no sliding doors moment. I can't relive my life. I'm not wild about this phrase that, you know, people use, life-changing experience or life-changing moment. But I guess in my case, it was life-changing. You know, there are many things I can't do anymore, and quite traumatic, and there were some real down moments, particularly when I thought I'd have to have an amputation and things. I've got very mixed emotions about the whole period. There are some things that I think were positives, which might sound surprising, but you know, I think I've grown in some ways. I've gained a huge amount of humility, and I value every moment more than I used to, and I realise how fragile life is and things like that. It's so easy to create boundaries for yourself and to say, I can't do that. So I had created all these limits for me, this kind of box that I couldn't move outside of, just because I had told myself, or maybe somebody else had told me, well, you can't do that. And I realised actually, you know, most of the limits are inside your head.
I was 19 years old, on a trip with my university, and a terrorist drove directly at me. I went straight over the bonnet of the car, and I hit the windshield, and I was thrown into the air for what felt like forever.